Hello, I've come to the Rudolf Steiner house in Weimar. Steiner worked at the Goethe archives in Weimar during the late 19th century for about 8 years, and he lived in this house at that time. Steiner wrote 2 books while he lived here about Goethe's conception of science and of the world, and that became an important part of his later writing and also his tireless work on social reform. The building fell into disrepair during the GDR era, but has now been renovated, as you can see. It's now used as an atelier for architecture. I'm sure that Steiner, if he was here today, would be very delighted by the very pleasant hall and workshop area inside. Steiner was very interested in the works of Kant and Schelling, and while he lived in Weimar he was also able to read the writings of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. He also had an interest in the nascent ideas of phenomenology, which I'll look at later, including the works of Brentano. Eventually he came to reject the ideas of epistemological limits as proposed by Kant, became very interested in trying to find a synthesis between the disparate realms of science and spirituality. Steiner assumed leadership of the German section of the Theosophical Society, which thereafter became the Anthroposophical Society. This involvement led to his designing the original Goethe-Arnhem building in Dornach, Switzerland, which is a world centre for the anthroposophical movement. After the First World War, Steiner became very politically active. He was opposed to the idea about creating new European borders based around ethnic groups, which he considered would lead to a lot of nationalism in Europe. He was also very focused upon the education debate and was involved in setting up the first Waldorf schools. Given my own work in education, I'm interested in the application of Steiner's humanitarian approach in Waldorf schools, and I'm interested generally in the process of how theory translates into practice, which implies a revisiting of methodological questions. I'm particularly interested in these things because my own school shares many of these same human and educational values, and a part of the purpose of this inquiry is to determine how I can justify these values. Waldorf education values a holistic fusion of matters of cognitive development with practical and emotional learning. The content of traditional disciplines is often incorporated into holistic thematic work that brings together the natural and human sciences, language learning, and the visual and performing arts. In science learning, objectives include the cultivation of a sense of the significance of holism as it pertains to nature, whereby people are not alienated from nature, but an integral part of it. The role of the imagination and of creative and artistic development is given a high profile. Planning for learning incorporates the principle of multiple intelligences, as characterized by Howard Gardner, whereby students employ different intelligence modalities and psychological processes, such as the verbal linguistic, the logical mathematical, pictorial, musical, interpersonal, and kinesthetic. There's a minimal use of standardized textbooks. Learning involves the development of independent thinking and collaborative discussion. It also supports students' understanding of ethical ideals and social responsibility. Student attainment is assessed through portfolio work rather than by way of traditional testing models. Normative grading approaches are avoided. All of these approaches to teaching and learning could equally apply to my school, which uses programs oriented on internationalism and global citizenship, including those of the International Baccalaureate. Teaching strategies focus on differentiation, recognizing the different learning circumstances and needs of individuals, and on student autonomy, collaboration, and flexibility of curriculum, whereby there's plenty of scope for students to develop personal interests. Curriculum seeks to balance a broad base of knowledge acquisition with the development of skills, both discipline-based and generic learning skills, and those pertaining to lifelong learning, with a focus on concept-driven learning. We call this method an inquiry-based approach to education, whereby, according to the IB, as learners, quote, we nurture our curiosity, developing skills for inquiry and research. We know how to learn independently and with others. We learn with enthusiasm and sustain our love of learning throughout life. My school, like most international schools I'm familiar with, seeks to extend these principles to all aspects of learning, including to technology, which can enhance efficiency, but also creativity and use of the imagination to address matters of design and other learning outcomes. Furthermore, my school looks to the principles of what's been called transformative learning, whereby close attention is paid to the frames of reference that comprise the structure of culture and the language by which people construe meaning and attribute coherence and significance. These principles privilege pedagogies that are, according to Metzerov, quote, more inclusive, discriminating, open, reflective, and emotionally able to change. Such frames of reference are better because they're more likely to generate beliefs and opinions that will prove more true or justified to guide action. End quote. Actually, transformative learning originates in the domain of adult education. It's used to describe circumstances where adults are able to transform their entire lives by way of learning practices that emancipate the mind, educating Rita style. The context is different in a school such as mine. Nevertheless, the objectives are similar. Transformative learning talks of developing routines of thinking and feeling and acting that are affirmative by disposition and thereafter conducive to constructing environments. It points out that habits of mind, which encompass social codes that may be cultural, linguistic, educational, economic, political, psychological, religious, and even aesthetic, can easily become destructive. For example, a predisposition to ethnocentrism, whereby others outside the immediate community are perceived as dishonest and inferior, ends up becoming destructive to the self. The result is a downward spiral of negative feelings, beliefs, judgments, and attitudes regarding specific individuals or groups and the self. So in my school, we seek to promote habits of mind and forms of metacognition that not only promote a positive self-image and a safe and secure learning environment, but that, for instance, support a positive outlook on other people, including those different to ourselves. We encourage critical reflection on assumptions about the self and others and other sources, which is a principle I should extend to the value of transformative learning and habits of mind. The most significant criticism of transformative learning I've come across pertains to the suggestion that learning objectives must seek to rise above prejudice by way of reflection and discourse. These criticisms argue that such an approach posits a form of decontextualized knowledge as a goal of learning. That's to say, learning has the intention to liberate learners of prejudice and enable them to become unprejudiced. However, this argument is itself based upon a particular stance or prejudice, the assumption that there is a correct sociological perspective on sociology. It refutes the hermeneutic tradition that there is nothing that is ahistorical or non-contextual. I might retort that self-reflection and respect for the integrity of others may be a particular form of prejudice by way of representing a particular set of values, yet still they represent a more mature morality. But I'm still susceptible to the argument of, by which standards? I'm challenged to define a more mature morality in universal terms, which would contradict my valuing of discourse and group learning. The natural sciences seem to have no difficulty in identifying universality, but it's a little more difficult in the social sciences. But if transformative learning can be refuted in this way, and all sociological theory refuted in the same way, then how can I justify particular education and pedagogical approaches? How can my school vindicate the teaching approaches it uses, other than anecdotally? How does Steiner justify the educational values he bequeathed to Waldorf schools? How can we justify any theory pertaining to the human condition and to the nature of mind outlined in the Weimar thesis? Perhaps empirically, although Lynn Warehouse argues that, despite its wide referencing in education, the theory of multiple intelligences is not at all well supported by empirical evidence and therefore should not be used as a basis for educational practice at all. I'm sure it will be equally difficult to empirically justify any of the educational values I've discussed so far. Although it's not that people haven't tried. The field of education theory, not unlike cognitive psychology, is vast. There have been all kinds of theories, speculative and empirical, of how children learn and therefore how schools should teach, but always justification has been difficult. One of the leading figures in the humanist tradition, and in some senses a follow-up to Steiner, was Jean Piaget. He studied the cognitive development of his own young children and discovered that, quote, "For children of the first stage of development, everything that is in any way active is conscious, even if it be stationary. In the second stage, consciousness is only attributed to things that can move. The sun and a bicycle are conscious. A table and a stone are not. During the third stage, an essential distinction is made between movement that is due to the object itself and movement that is introduced by an outside agent. Finally, in the fourth stage, consciousness is restricted to the animal world." Given that children can be seen to pass through these distinct stages of cognitive development, Piaget argued, as Waldorf schools and my school does too, that education should be learner-centred and constructivist. Learning should be a process of adding new concepts to prior knowledge so as to build understanding. Piaget said that this points to experience-based learning and a consideration for learning styles, and for student influence over the curriculum, and support for curiosity, and the establishment of safe learning environments, and so on. And as regards justification? Well, Piaget introduced several theoretical notions to support his claims. As well as the stages of learning, these include theories pertaining to the sociological, whereby learning is sociocentric rather than egocentric, and also theories of aesthetic thought, pertaining to the role of perception and memory and other non-rational thought. But actually, it's not these that interest me here, not given my quest to justify claims to universal features. It's his theory of genetic epistemology. Piaget uses a domain of biological cognitivism to describe knowledge acquisition by way of a structuralist account. He introduced the notion of reflective abstractions, which shares affinities with Kant's transcendental reflection. It associates the structure underpinning a priori cognition with intentional thought and the impetus for action, which in turn is perceived anew qualitatively. In other words, the mind possesses an innate design that enables it to learn in particular ways and to use the process of self-reflection to create further learning. And the teaching and learning strategies of child-centeredness and constructivism are particularly well suited to these innate structures. Piaget's cognitive theory was extremely influential in the 20th century in a world that, assigning the broadest of meta-narratives, craved structuralist and naturalistic explanations for matters that were extremely complex and which, despite the tremendous activities in science and technology, were hard to comprehend. Actually, Piaget was not the first to develop a theory such as this. I've already discussed Kant, but even before then, notions of cognitive development being reliant upon particular physiological structures have a long heritage among thinkers. In the 17th century, Descartes said, "Knowledge of the world is constructed by way of resources innate to the mind," even as, at the same time, John Locke was saying the opposite. "The infant's mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate ready to be written on by way of experience." In the last half-century, Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar has been influential. Standing in the Cartesian and Kantian tradition of innate cognitive structures, it argues that children always develop language with certain specific grammatical features, such as the ability to distinguish nouns from verbs. Consequently, these features are to be considered a property of shared physiology, revealed as universal grammar. Well, I'm not going to do a full survey of the literature, in part because there's such a wide variety of views being published every month, probably wider than the entire field of aesthetic approaches to art. However, I would like to introduce the ideas of Jürgen Habermas, which are very compelling. He begins by acknowledging that while natural science can corroborate findings empirically, the social science pertaining to cognitive development and children's learning doesn't have that luxury at all. Any theory rests on assumptions, which in turn must be tested, and then the assumptions underpinning the testing conditions must be tested, and so forth. The quest for corroborative proof is impossible. We must look elsewhere if we're going to be able to establish universal attributes. Habermas is associated with the tradition of critical theory, which looks back to Adorno and the Frankfurt School. His work addresses the foundations of social theory and epistemology, and is intended not just for learning theory, but the analysis of all elements of modern society and democracy. Habermas seeks to show how a theory of language, which embraces language as a fundamental architecture of society, can be used to support social science, and in particular, referring back to Herder, how linguistic constructions can reveal universal structures that are central to social values. He does this by developing a new conception of reason, which, unlike traditional conceptions, is not based on principles of neutrality or instrumentality alone. Instead, reason and other components of linguistic structure are embedded in the act of communication and in social contexts that are bound in paradox. Habermas delves into the nature of cognitive and dialectical methodologies and concludes that any theoretical approach isolating precognitive universality from language idiosyncrasies must inevitably act to destabilize conceptions pertaining to the hierarchical relationship between rational and empirical knowledge, and between, putting it in Kantian terms, the transcendental and synthetic. Habermas says the implication of this is that any theory of the precognitive mind, any theory pertaining to innate physiological structures in the mind that's grounded by an analytical approach to dialectical problems, is going to be unstable. He says this acknowledgement of the weakness of natural and social science methodologies acting independently, of natural science being unable to say anything about the social condition of humanity, and social science being unable to say anything about universal features, creates conditions for a relationship of mutual dependence. In terms of children's learning development, his conclusions imply that psychology requires the support of cognitive science and vice versa. Habermas argues for a new methodology that might fuse methodologies and enable a theoretical approach to, for instance, establishing universal features in cognitive development. But he insists it cannot be based exclusively on empirical research or on dialectical descriptions of regularities. It requires a discourse epistemology, which looks to community consensus for establishing the validity of belief, in this case to a shared community of empiricists and hermeneutists. In other words, any theory pertaining to social science must avoid the polemics and instead look to a broad range of epistemologies encompassing contradictions and paradoxes, and thereafter find common ground. Habermas has looked to the domain of social justice as a suitable field to explore this new discourse methodology. If universal principles concerning the rule of law can be established for a critical social context that embodies pluralism, then perhaps the domains of mind and matter might come next. At the beginning of this episode, I played a section from my cycle Songs of Innocence, based upon a text by William Blake and performed by the choir at Munich International School. I'll finish with another section now. Thanks for listening.